today I want to let you know a little bit about me so you can say, why am I listening to this lady on Friday morning? First of all, as I said earlier, I'm with Cameron & Associates as one of their employee assistance panel providers. I have a Ph.D. in community and organizational psychology. I'm a licensed professional counselor in the state of Georgia. I have had an opportunity to work with the Care and Counseling Centers of Georgia. They are located just off the Emory campus in Atlanta, and they have several locations throughout the state as a general provider. I am a federal contractor, mostly with the law enforcement agencies, and I've done a little bit of everything from debriefing individuals who have come in from difficult assignments, as well as coaching folks in management and executive ranks, which I haven't done it in a while, and based on recent news, maybe I need to get back up there and do some more. And I've been a trainer with the Secret Service, the FBI, as well as the National Security Agency. I spent 2 years with the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder after 9/11. One of the reasons is because I spent 22 years with Delta Airlines, and one of my jobs there was to respond to emergencies as they occurred. The way that worked at that time in the airline industry, if you were the largest airline at the nearest Category X or great big giant airport, that's who responded in case of an event. Didn't matter who the event was about, you got to respond. So unfortunately, I had the opportunity to respond to several events in the 90s. And with that background and with my specifics in my education and the fact that my dissertation chair was called up to the National Center after 9/11 to do an investigation on the response to 9/11, I had a chance to go up there for a couple of years to White River Junction, Vermont. It is cold in White River Junction, Vermont. There are 6 days of summer. I spent my 2 years, completed them, and ran home. And I'll be using a lot of that information and what I learned up there in our presentation today. On the reference page, you'll also see their website. It is, without a doubt, the most important, viable place to go for information for the layperson, for the clinician, for the professional, or if you're just curious about it. So that will be listed there as well. I've also been an instructor and a visiting lecturer at Georgia State University, where I received my degree. I occasionally go back and give a few talks there at the Honors College as well as in the Department of Psychology. And I'm with Georgia Post, the Peace Officer Standards and Training, and I'm certified to teach in the areas of communicational, emotional skills, diversity training, and I do that quite often. All right, so again, welcome to everybody for coming today. Let's go ahead and get started. The learning objectives for this particular course are as follows. We want you to understand a history of PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. We want you to be able to get sensitized to the nature and impact of traumatic stress. And we also want you to become familiar with the practices, the recommendations, the accommodations for working with individuals who have been diagnosed with PTSD. One of the things that is not a learning objective is to make you a qualified clinician. When you leave out of here today, I don't want you looking through that lens of thinking, oh, I see this person that's sweating profusely, acting a little strange, having a hard time talking, and is shaking. They must have PTSD. That's not the intent of today. We're just going to familiarize you with some of the behaviors, some of the emotions, and some of the things that you might find observable either in the workplace or in the classroom with individuals who are diagnosed PTSD. Now, I'm going to also let you know that just because PTSD exists, it really is not as prevalent as you might think in the population. We hear it a lot on the news. We hear it a lot in TV. We see dramatic TV series that portray it, and you'd almost get the idea that this is everywhere. Probably not. There are some individuals who qualify for a diagnosis. Others simply have some of the symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress, and we call that PTSS. So that's kind of a step down. And then the rest of us probably just have some general anxiety that's not necessarily a disorder. So PTSD, and we'll talk about the statistics as a part of the presentation, but PTSD in general is not diagnosed in a high percentage of the population. So when you leave here, we want you to be able to speak knowledgeably about PTSD. We want you to be able to demonstrate some sensitivity to individuals who may be dealing with PTSD. And again, develop an action plan for accommodating and implementing practices and recommendations if you happen to be working with or in the presence of an individual with PTSD. So what is it? The Diagnostic Statistical Manual that we use in a clinical setting is getting ready to change. I've been saying that for 7 years now, and I understand it's really going to happen in October. In October, they are changing the definition of PTSD just a little bit. Up until October of this year, PTSD has been one of the many diagnoses available under anxiety. Now it will become its own diagnosis, set apart. It will no longer be included under the anxiety disorders. Do you have any idea what one of the reasons might be for that? I'll tell you. PTSD is the only diagnosis that we are able to diagnose as a result of an external event. Everything else is an internal event. But by the nature of the definition, PTSD necessarily involves exposure to an external event. And that's different. It's always been that way in the literature, but it was up under a category under the anxiety disorders that we thought of as internally manifesting. Some kind of chemical issue, something had happened and we became anxious, or we would say, you're just nervous. So it will have a standalone diagnosis coming up in October of 2015. And now we talk about it in terms of it is a psychiatric disorder that can occur following exposure to death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence as follows. You're either the victim of it, you're directly involved, you may be the witness to it, and let me say, that does not include watching it on TV. So that's not even qualifying as indirect exposure. So you have to be a direct witness to it. You may be indirectly exposed to it. A lot of times, professionals who go out in the aftermath of a disaster, when they are at a site, doing cleanup, collection of data and evidence, we used to talk about that as secondary traumatization. If you are a counselor, you may hear someone's story over and over in great detail, or you may be exposed, if you're a therapist, you may be exposed to a heavy population or percentage of your clients. That's going to be part of that professional exposure to it. So what we used to call secondary traumatization, we'll now talk about as indirect exposure, but repeated indirect exposure. All right, so there's a history of PTSD. You can go all the way back, and there are books out there about it in the Greek philosophers who talk about PTSD. You can find examples of it in the various faith literature, such as the Bible. 1678, it became first written about and diagnosed specifically in the context of war by Swiss physicians, and it was called nostalgia. As you can imagine, it was not desirable to get a diagnosis of nostalgia. People thought of that as weak. It meant that you were mentally disordered and mentally disabled if you were unable to return to your combat zone. During the American Civil War, it was referred to as the soldier's heart. By World War I, phrases like shell shock, war neurosis were introduced. You can see right where Freud comes in. Right at the end of World War II or World War I, we get the word neurosis added. World War II, it was talked about as battle fatigue. And in that time between World War I and World War II, it began to be spoken of not as a physical problem, but as an emotional problem. Combat exhaustion was also a familiar term. Combat exhaustion fell out of the vernacular somewhere around 1968 at the end of the Vietnam War, and it began to be spoken of as post-Vietnam syndrome. By 1980, it had taken on the term of post-traumatic stress disorder, and it has maintained that to this day. And even with the new introduction of DSM-5, again, it's still post-traumatic stress disorder or post-traumatic stress symptoms. Any questions so far? So what are some of the types of trauma that might trigger symptoms that would lead us to diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder? Well, serious accidents, combat, natural disasters. One of the things that we investigated while I was at the National Center for PTSD, we looked at some of the hurricanes. Remember the season of Florida? They had 5 hurricanes come through. They just kind of trained through. That was an opportunity for us back then to look at what the results were. And there have been some huge natural disasters that have resulted in whole populations receiving diagnostics around PTSD. Sexual assault and physical assaults, muggings. If you're a victim of a crime, it's not unusual for you to be diagnosed with PTSD. Terrorist attacks. We often hear in the news about ISIS, and we think of the terrorist attacks as being over there. We know what terrorist attacks look like on our soil. We remember 9/11. But sometimes terrorist attacks are also more homegrown. They're more local. So sometimes gang activities actually can come up under some of the terrorist attacks, home invasions. And indirect exposure, again, due to those professional roles where you may be going in not in the midst of the event, but in the role of aftermath. So how common is it? Here's some of the stats you might be interested in. Trauma over a lifetime. Okay, let me just say right off the bat, everybody has trauma. If you are 5 minutes old, you just had trauma. Okay? So everybody has trauma in their lifetime. And over the extent of a lifetime, 60% of men and 50% of women are generally going to be exposed to at least one event that qualifies as the kind of serious trauma that we were just looking at a few minutes ago. Why do you think the percentages are higher for men than they are for women? Larger number serve in the military. And have experienced combat. And in general, continue to be in some of the more dangerous jobs or in the position as head of family. They're often more targeted. So, and again, this is reported now. There's a lot of debate and conflict about is it underreported or overreported. This is not the place for us to make the determination on that. But imagine, if you would, for many men who may be asked a question by that Psychology 101 student who's doing a wonderful, helping out with a laboratory interview, and this big burly guy is asked by this young, personable, sweet young person, so tell me if you've had any of the following traumas in your life, and have you had any of the following responses? sometimes they might be better served, in their mind, to not respond, right? They may say, no, I'm good. I haven't had anything like that. Or if I had it, it was no big deal. So whenever you're looking at the statistics, you want to keep in mind, these are approximations. So 60% of men, 50% of women, that's still pretty close. PTSD, actual diagnostics around, or a diagnosis around PTSD over the lifetime, you're looking at about 7 to 8% of the population. So in the U.S., it's around 26 million, give or take a few 100,000. If you look at PTSD diagnosed in a given year, you're looking at about 5.2 million adults. When do you think a diagnosis of PTSD is given? Let's say an event happens. It's 9:20 in the morning. Let's say an event happens as we're leaving here at noon, and there's a railroad derailment, and there are multiple injuries, and we happen to see it because we're right there at that crossing. When do you think PTSD will manifest such that it can be diagnosed? It's going to be at least 6 months, because it's natural in the aftermath of something like that for you to be distressed, right? And you may go through many different feelings. So you might be inappropriate to diagnose PTSD at that point. You want to give it some time, see how your coping skills work, see how the coping mechanisms manifest themselves, and hopefully you won't develop PTSD, but you will have this memory that you will deal with. You may have a lesser form at PTSS or just generalized anxiety. But we want to accommodate and let the natural progression of that response or set of responses to take place before we get into diagnostics, because PTSD as a diagnosis for a lot of folks becomes a label. There's still stigma around it. So we want to make sure it's appropriate to make the diagnosis. It may also be that it takes years for it to manifest. With the Vietnam War ending in the early 70s, there was an attempt made to quantify how many of the returning soldiers had or qualified for a diagnosis of PTSD, and it was a pretty low amount. I think it was around 17%. 10 years later, that went up to 33%. 25 years later, that went up again. And here we are in the era that we're seeing more and more veterans from the Vietnam era who are experiencing in their post-retirement the evidence for PTSD. And it's not necessarily that they were hiding it all this time, but now that life has moved forward, they're now in a point in time where they're relaxed, they may be reflecting back at this point in time in their lives, and they're getting the diagnosis of PTSD for many, not all. At some point in a lifetime, a PTSD diagnosis may occur, 4% of men, 10% of women. And PTSD in rape victims, a full 1/3% within 2 years report and qualify for a diagnosis of PTSD for sexual assault and rape. And most of those are in women. So let's look a little bit at the combat statistics. Best guess, somewhere between 4 and 20% of the Iraq and Afghanistan veterans have qualified for a PTSD diagnosis. I shared with you a little bit about the Vietnam diagnosis. And some of the complicating factors in, again, wrapping our head around how many people really develop PTSD as a diagnosis. Well, the delayed onset. A lot of folks do not go back, 30 years past. They may not access, if they're a combat veteran, they may not go to the VA to get a diagnosis. And so that may not get caught up in some of the statistics out there. Many people do not get treated at all. It's not unusual that it occurs at the same time or is comorbid with other diagnostics like traumatic brain injuries. Sometimes it may even be missed. And let's face it, the diagnosis of PTSD is a moving target. It has evolved and developed, as we saw in the history of PTSD. It has developed over time. And as we've become more aware of it and we've gotten more concentrated and better at defining what is it, what does it look like, how does it manifest over time, then that has changed. So our statistics today may be more accurate, but we really don't know. We don't have anything we can for sure compare it to. Any questions on the statistics? And this is just kind of a brief overview. All right. There appear to be some risk factors for the development of PTSD because everybody who experiences an event doesn't necessarily develop PTSD. Again, we saw in the statistics, it may be just a few of you or one of you comes away from the exact same event at the exact same time and may have developed PTSD. What we're finding is that for the factors pre-trauma might include a history of PTSD. There is a cumulative factor. The more times you're exposed to traumatic events, that becomes cumulative. They don't get isolated or boxed off. So if you've had many stressful, traumatic events in your life, you are increasing the odds of developing PTSD. And this could be your individual history or a family history. Life stressors. The more life stressors that you have, the higher the opportunity for you to develop PTSD in response to a traumatic event. What are some of the life stressors you think would be critical to developing or being prone or open to developing PTSD? Loss of a child. Divorce. Domestic violence, yes. And financial strain. Yes, more stressors, right? So life stressors factor into this. Poor coping skills can certainly factor into this. There are some folks that you meet that are just resilient. They come through and they've just done one thing after another. They may have a similar timeline of traumas as everybody else, but they just come in and seem to get through it and stay positive and stay on task, and they're not faking it. Others have one or two of those events, and they may go into some kind of depressive episode, or they may feel picked on. They may begin to feel that they need to move back from the world a little bit. So the more coping skills that you have to deal with adversity or tough choices, the better prepared you are to defend your own self against the development of PTSD. Personality characteristics. There is some evidence out there that our personality characteristics can influence whether or not we are more prone to develop PTSD. What might be a personality characteristic that you would think might be connected?
Someone who's not optimistic.
Having that pessimistic or negative viewpoint of the world, absolutely, yes.
But can you also be a person who appears to everyone to be that you're handling all of these things, and because you're so good at managing it all, but you still can have PTSD even though you appear to be managing all of these stressors in your life?
So the question is it possible for you to have a diagnosis of PTSD even though externally to the world you may be presenting as completely functional? It is possible. And I will say that this is sort of a two-edged sword or a flipped coin. On the one hand, one of the things that we consider tremendously in the diagnosis is how much do your symptoms interfere with your capacity to function in your life, in your work, in your off time, with friends, with family, on a daily basis. But we also know that some people have coping mechanisms where they are just pillars of strength. They're usually the ones that come in at 7 in the morning or 2 hours before, and they've got everything very organized, and they're very invested in things being done right, meeting deadlines. They're very on top of it. In other words, they often are diagnosed as workaholics. And when they present a little intense, but still capable. Now, don't take that and go back and start pointing to people in the workplace and going, PTSD, tell me about your trauma. We don't want to do that. But yes, one of the coping skills for a lot of folks is, and a lot of this is connected to not only the history of trauma that they've had, the kinds of traumas that they've had, but also what their kind of personality is, what their attachment is like. For a lot of folks, that means they are going to come out and appear strong. What we hear about then in the therapeutic intervention is what happens when they go home, or what happens when they get alone, and they'll find a reason or a way to get alone. So yes, you can appear to the outside world as great, and then you'll find that their family members may tell you different things, or be a little surprised if you say, oh, they're so great, they're always in a good mood, they're always playing jokes, and they're like, well, they come home and sit in a chair and don't move for 3 hours in a dark room. That's not what I was expecting. So a lot of times to the outside world, looks great. Inside world may be a little dysfunctional. And I also want to say that's another reason for a lot of folks to not follow up and bring that to a doctor's attention or reach out or even go online to look at information, because their reasoning is, I do my job great. I haven't missed a day of work or a day of school. I'm doing super. My grades are good. Everybody's happy with me. People love me. And I feel good when I'm out there. But then there's the other side of it. Genetics. I love the DNA and genetic studies. It is amazing. Weekly, just about, we find that there's new information coming out about what part of the genetic makeup is attached to some activity, event, emotion. So we're finding out more and more and more based on the genetic research that continues to be done. But we are beginning to find that there are certain places, certain protein combinations in certain parts of the helix that might be connected to the development of PTSD, or may be connected to your response to being exposed to some kind of event. The same thing is with the brain structure. We've all got brains. They all look really similar, but they work in different ways. We know from our experience before that might be why I might suffer from light depression, and I might have a sibling or someone close to me who suffers from another level of depression. Our brains are pretty much functionally the same, or structurally the same, but they may function different. So we're finding out more about the formation of the brain and the neurotransmitters and some of the other structure and the plasticity of the brain's ability to adapt when it has either been injured by disease, injury, or the experience of trauma or some other event in the environment. And we have really come a long way, I think, in the last 10 to 12, maybe 15 years now, since I've been more in the practice of therapy. We've come a long way recognizing how much of that can be changed. And we have some really cool ways to do it. So all kinds of different strategies, as well as implementation of other things like electrical impulses. Gender. also has a lot to do with the development of PTSD. We continue to see, even in some of the more controlled environment or controlled studies, that women tend to have higher rates of development of PTSD compared to men. And I'm going to ask you why you think that is. Nobody wants to say the politically incorrect thing. It's okay.
Based on the makeup of women, their emotional structure?
Yes, based on the makeup of women and their emotional structures. Women continue to be taught, and we'll jump back up to the genetics. It appears there may be some genetic relevance around the development, the ability to develop, the capacity for seeing emotions, recognizing emotions, being able to accurately name emotions, being congruent with expressing the emotion that you're feeling on the inside. And certainly we know that we continue in this culture to encourage that in our baby girls, and not so much in our baby boys. When the baby boy falls down and gets hurt, we tend to say, jump up, you're okay, let's go. When the baby girl falls down, we tend to say, oh, are you okay? How does that feel? And when they're close to what we think they should be feeling, we start to reward them. Children are sponges and really wonderful at being able to pick up on what does mom and dad and that adult caregiver like to get from me, so that I'll get hugs and kisses and maybe an ice cream or two later on. And so we still have an aptitude for imparting upon our kids gender differences when it comes to emotions. There is a different training that I do on communication. One of the things that we do is we hand out this matrix of emotions. There are 7 basic emotions, 3 different levels of intensity, or the amount of tension inside the body, how much you feel a certain emotion. And we ask people to put 2 words in each intensity level for each emotion. For instance, if you had happy, and you had a low intensity cell and a moderate intensity cell and a high intensity cell, a low intensity word for happy might be what? Okay. In my world, okay is pretty low. I'm kind of an intense person. High intensity word might be ecstatic. Somewhere in the middle might be okay, joyful, glad, content, right. The kids are really good at listening to us and discerning, coming up with their own feeling word vocabulary. And the cool thing about it is, if you get the right word at the right time, it actually does act as a physiological kind of decompressor. It'll lower the blood pressure, it'll increase the blood flow to the healthy places. It helps your digestive tract. It will take your heart rate down and your blood pressure down. That's why it's important when we talk about talking to yourself and getting to that place where you're calming yourself down. That's what you're doing, and you're identifying those emotions. Inevitably, in almost every single time I've distributed it to adults, women have more words on the sheet than guys. Until we give them some hints, and then they can start rattling them off pretty quick. But as far as just coming up with them out of the blue, out of their brain, it's a little bit more difficult. So under gender, a part of that appears to be the capacity to being able to name and claim and tame your emotions. All right, so during the trauma, some of the risk factors include the severity of the trauma. Where is it in relationship to you? Is it really close? Are you in the midst of it? Or are you a block away, half a mile away? The kind of trauma that it is, and the very nature of the trauma. I recently spoke with someone who happened to be in the vicinity in New York a few years back when they were carrying some waste through, and the train derailed, and there was a fire that engulfed a neighborhood and killed several people on the train, or some people on the train, and this particular person was in the town. They were not literally touched by any of it. They were evacuated because of chemical issues, but we are working on now, a few years later, he's living close to a railroad again, and his anxiety has begun to manifest. So the very nature of the trauma in that particular case, along with these other issues of proximity, severity, and the type. For him, as for many folks, fire is a trauma. So, now post-trauma, if you sustain physical injuries from the trauma, that can contribute to possibly developing a diagnosis for PTSD if you have a lack of social support. Everybody needs a network or a support network with whom they can share their thoughts and feelings. Blaming the victim. What do you think this might be a reference to?
Sexual assault.
I'm sorry?
Sexual assault.
Yeah, certainly around sexual assault, and we hear it all too often. Not only might the victim blame themselves, but if there is an external voice of whatever nature that is saying, well, if you hadn't been in that place at that time, that wouldn't have happened. Or, you know, you should have thought about that. In the context of combat, one of the most often heard phrases is, you knew what you were signing up for. So sometimes what's intended as maybe a side comment or an innocent comment can really speak to blaming the victim. Secondary traumatization, now called indirect, and a lack of treatment for individuals who don't seek out and talk to somebody, even if I don't need to. Going to a debriefing, talking with their physician, finding a therapist, talking to a counselor at school or their faith leader, getting somebody in there to talk to them. Now, how is that different from social support? Those things I just named, how is that different from social support?
Social support could just be people in your community, your parents, your grandparents, family, and relatives who are not trained to be able to help you work through those issues.
Absolutely.
They support you and say, I'm sorry that happened, but they can't help, they don't have the skills or the training to help you to really be able to look inside and start dealing with those things. And the other thing is when you are using social support, many times you will not share your gut level feelings with them, and there are things that you may not really want them to know that you're dealing with.
Correct. So just to encapsulate that and capture, social support is often made up of individuals who are not trained to really work you through the process of your experience of that trauma. They're there, they're wonderful, they're necessary, they're needed, but they're emotionally connected to you and involved. And so when you come in telling your story, they're going to respond to it in a different way than that third-party person who has a different training and a different investment in the relationship.
Say a psychiatrist or a psychologist, they may be able to work with other people that they don't have a relationship with, but they don't always use those training skills for people that they are socially involved with.
Absolutely. Again, the comment being that even for those of us who have the training, when it happens to someone that we have a connectedness with, an emotional investment with, and I absolutely support this. We cannot be that professional role to them. I can't do it internally, and they probably will not respond to me. Most of them don't listen to me anyway in my family. Yes, ma'am.
You also have to look at more of the passive support that social support implies versus more of an assertive, I'm going to get treatment from a trained professional.
That's true. That passive support, those that are there, they come and go. They might be available for you to, if you have your phone next to the bedstand at night and pick it up at 2 in the morning and you have that one friend you can call and connect with. That's a different response pattern. Did I capture that? Okay. Thank you. That's perfect. Dead on. All right. So, some of the common symptoms of PTSD that you might see. And actually, this comes under the 3 categories that as clinicians we would be looking at. You would have to have so many in a certain period of time at a certain intensity level. But we're not going to get that detailed. But just to give you an idea, we look at the aspects of the reliving of the experience, the avoidance of the experience, and whether or not the individual is experiencing some hyperarousal. So in the reliving pieces, that could come in the form of flashbacks, nightmares, recurrent, intrusive, upsetting memories, and strong reactions, just to name a few. Avoidance, sometimes emotional numbing. And by that, I'm talking about people who say, yeah, every time I think about it, I can tell the story over and over. It doesn't bother me a bit. I don't feel anything. Yes, you do. So that numbing becomes really a coping mechanism. Feeling detached from it. Almost being, I've had individuals tell me that they feel like they are out of their body, looking down on the event or somewhere else. Forgetting details, lack of interest in things that they normally would like to do. Sometimes that's family, sex, hobbies, and persistent negative beliefs, negative emotions, or negative expectations. In other words, thinking that the world is a bad place, and things are never going to go good for me again. Things will always be bad. There will always be this trauma in my life. I will never get over it. So it's that kind of a negative imbalance. In the hyperarousal, difficulty concentrating, that hypervigilance or that startle easily. If it thunders here, you may see an example of that. Irritable or being very aggressive and it's out of context to what's going on, and sleep problems. Now, you may notice, as you look at some of this, you may think, I got that, I got that, I got that. Okay, do not self-diagnose, all right? No, this is all of us probably feel each of these things at some point in our life around something. Presentation the next day when you're finishing your slides at 2:15 in the morning. Yeah, I probably could check a lot of these off. But it's passing, and by 1 o'clock this afternoon when I pull into the Dairy Queen, I'll be feeling much better. Oh, I'm talking about me. So just having these in your life doesn't mean that you're qualifying for a PTSD diagnosis, nor would anybody else. So if you see somebody or you're in a conversation with somebody and they said, man, I couldn't sleep at all the last 2 nights. I don't know what it is. I don't have a test coming up. I don't have any project deadlines coming up. I just couldn't sleep. You know, I got up a couple of times and you know, for some reason I yelled at the cat this morning and there was no reason for me to do that. And, you know, while I'm at it, I hope this just doesn't go on forever. Well, I'm getting a little bit of all 3 columns in there. But that doesn't mean I have PTSD. And it doesn't mean they have PTSD. So again, these are just some of the things to be aware of that are included as a part of the diagnosing of PTSD, but manifesting them even as a cluster of symptoms doesn't necessarily mean you have PTSD. Let's rearrange it a little bit. Sometimes it's easier for me if I think in terms of what are the physical aspects, what are the behavioral aspects, and what are the emotional aspects. So you'll see some of these things getting just a little bit rearranged into something that as a layperson I can probably associate a little bit better. So under the physical, you might have fatigue, tiredness, chest pains, heart pounding sensations, grinding of teeth, the development of sleep problems, including nightmares, difficulty breathing, profuse sweating, digestive distress, vomiting, diarrhea, constant reflux that doesn't respond generally to medications, twitches, tremors. And again, those are just a few examples of what the physical manifestation could look like. Behaviorally, you might experience a person with PTSD as withdrawing, restless. They may have emotional outbursts. It doesn't have to be anger. It might be tearfulness. Or it might be happiness at an inappropriate time. Suspicious, paranoid, loss of interest in the things that they normally like to do, substance abuse, whether that's alcohol, prescription medication, or illegal, illicit drugs. Pacing, don't look at me today because I pace a lot, or a lowered sex drive. And in some case, an increased sex drive. Emotionally, they may experience anxiety or panic, guilt, fear, denial, irritability, depression, rage, agitation, apprehension. Now we're getting into our feeling words, right? And any of the above in any combination. So again, that's just a different way of presenting it, but it's a little less clinical. Some of the triggers for PTSD, crowds can be triggers. Being in the presence or of an environment that's similar. I was telling you earlier about the gentleman who years ago experienced the train derailment and the horror of that, and now lives close to a railroad track, never thought about what the consequence might be, and now is re-experiencing some symptoms from that earlier event. Images, seeing images. I have a lot of folks that don't watch the news anymore. I'm turning into one of them because the images are just constant. But again, remember, we don't get diagnoses of PTSD simply from watching the images. Some of you may remember 9/11 and how they just kept looping the tape all day long. Certainly it created stress for an awful lot of folks, but that does not get into the diagnosis of PTSD. So that kind of secondary traumatization doesn't apply. Video games, violent video games can sometimes be a trigger. Movies, etc. Having your personal space invaded. For those who especially like to withdraw, separate, you start to get up within about 5 feet of their personal space, you may detect that they've got some changes in how they respond to you. Those are external triggers. Some of the internal triggers, the most powerful one of the senses to be an internal trigger for PTSD is the sense of smell. The sense of smell is the only sensory organ that does not go through any other mechanism to get information into the brain. Everything else has to go through some kind of gear or mechanism to get the information into the brain so the brain can process it and determine what do I want you to do in response. The nose goes straight in. Smells go straight in. And those can be some of the most powerful memories that will come up the fastest and the most accurate. not unusual for folks who have been exposed to certain events that have smells associated with them to talk about, I can still smell that smell. Or I was going down the road one day. I had a gentleman who was in charge of, in Vietnam, one of his jobs was to go out and patch up all the roads and the runways and all every time they get blown up. And he went through an area one day where they were repaving and had an episode that was completely unexpected. And why it triggered that day and not the many other days I'm sure if you live in Atlanta, he's been exposed to road repair a lot. Why it manifested that day, I don't know. But that became a significant trigger for him. Anniversary dates, loud noises, all of those can be, and this is not limited, these are not the only triggers that may occur or may trigger a PTSD episode, but they're certainly some of the more viable ones. So, again, I want to caution you, the purpose of the training today is not to become a clinician, and just because you may observe some PTSD symptoms or symptoms associated with PTSD, that does not mean you're diagnosing PTSD in somebody. It's a lot more complicated than that. And again, we've noted earlier, a lesser observation. So when the symptoms present don't meet the criteria for PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, we often refer to that as post-traumatic stress symptoms. And really what we're looking at and what we'll be doing in an interview technique is to determine the ability of function versus dysfunction in their daily life. Now, one of the things that I'm not going to cover in this particular session is the various kinds of therapies and outcomes that are available. If you have questions about that, that's a great time to call Cameron and Associates. And those questions can be answered by the clinicians on the line. And if you need to, we can get you hooked up to someone who can address it further. But that's really not the context that we're working with here today. So for the next half, or the last half of what we're dealing with in this particular presentation, I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about, so let's say that you have someone that you're working with or that you find in the classroom or on campus in your environment who has a diagnosis of PTSD, or maybe just has some strong symptoms that come up under that post-traumatic stress, but it doesn't qualify for a diagnosis. What do you do? So let's look at that. Now I'm going to tell you right off the bat, there's been an awful lot of research that's been done in the scientific literature around student veterans and how it is, to, what their experience is coming back on campus or coming onto campus and integrating into student life. And I'm going to use that as the model to talk about how do we create a student veteran-friendly campus, and what are some of the strategies that we can use when we're working with them. And then I'm going to go back and we're going to also apply that model to just individuals in civilian life who may be in your presence, that you may work alongside with, others who may be in the classroom who have had other traumas that qualify for PTSD but are not necessarily as a result of combat. So we'll use combat first. Fair enough? Awesome. All right, so what is the policy in your workplace or on your campus for working with individuals who have PTSD? I see a lot of wide eyes. I see a lot of, I don't know, do you know? Don't look at me. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I don't think that we necessarily have a policy on working with, especially students who have PTSD, but we do have 2 counselors on campus that can be referred, crisis intervention perhaps.
Yes.
Normally don't see students past 3 to 5 sessions, and at that point we refer the student. Some of our students already are working with a counselor off campus or a psychiatrist, but generally we meet the student where he or she is.
Yes.
At the time that they need counseling or other support services.
Excellent. So you're absolutely right, and that's pretty common. Most organizations, schools, region system, they don't have a specific policy that specifically addresses folks on campus who have been diagnosed with PTSD. But we have all kinds of rules around where is the person, what's going on in their world, what may be inhibiting or influencing the learning process for them on campus, and what can we do to accommodate whatever those needs are. So that's really where you got to get a little bit familiar with what's available. For instance, you mentioned that you have counselors that are available, and you also have ways to connect them out into community resources that can be a support for them. And it sounds like you all are clear in what your role is for them on campus, and especially getting them connected. And then what's the boundary between that role and when you hand them off to that other external resource? And that's true for just about everybody. It's not just on campuses, right? It'd be wonderful if I could do everything for all people all the time, but we can't do that. So it's getting connected, finding out what the resources are, not only on campus, in your neighborhood, so to speak, but in your community, in the communities that surround you, and maybe into the state or even federal levels. And there's an awful lot of stuff out there with the emphasis these days on post-traumatic stress disorder. It's becoming something that we are thinking of not as it's a psychiatric disorder, but it's not a mental dysfunction. It's not mental illness. Remember, because the external event is the cause. That's the factor that has to be present for it to even be considered. So we're really talking about this kind of transition phase of going through a traumatic event and the resulting stuff that comes from that. So you won't be alone, and it's probably not even the best thing for you as helpers, as connectors, as members of the faculty of the administration to try to take on the one-stop shop when working with folks who have PTSD. So that's excellent, and I appreciate that. And I've been really impressed in all of the technical colleges that I've visited so far that there is this real awareness and availability of that kind of service for the returning veterans. So let's see. Let's talk about it as far as the military goes, transitioning from military life. They're in the military, and what happens in the military? Who's been in the military? Awesome. Thank you all for your service. Thank you so much. So think back, not that long ago, to what was it like that day that you said bye to mom and dad and the family, and you began your venture into the military. Where'd you go? Basic training, absolutely. Basic training. What do they do the first day at basic training? They yell at you. They kill you. A lot of what they're doing in basic training is they're breaking down the old you, right? They're breaking down so they can rebuild. And when you are rebuilt into that finely tuned, heavily trained unit, you are like one. You move together. You know each other's ins and outs, the strengths and the not so good strengths. Right? Everybody's on the same thought process. And so what's happened is now you've recreated that family is your unit. And you have emotional connections and ties. Yeah, probably forever. If you see them in the middle of the street now, it's like no time has passed, and you run into each other's arms, and you have jokes that your family can't understand, right? So that's a great part of the military life is, again, it is recreating or creating a new family environment. So what we often find in military life is disciplined, is regimented. You know what your job is, how to do it, when to do it, where to do it, who to do it with or without, and why to do it. We don't get that clear in our civilian life sometimes, but certainly in the military there is a regimentation. There is a camaraderie that is developed. It becomes your family, and it's very action-oriented. Again, you get clear on what your role is. And you're also clear about the roles of the other people around you. So you don't waste a lot of time going to somebody to ask for something when that's not their role. Then we come out and we go into regular life. We return to our homes and we go into student life, and we are carrying often these same characteristics. And what is student life generally like?
There's a lot of independence.
A lot of independence.
It's unstructured.
It is unstructured. You can come to class or not come to class in most classes, right? You can do the best job possible or not. You can pay your brother to go sit in your class while you go out on a date, you know. There's all kinds. It's a much less structured. The teacher or the faculty is probably not going to come and pursue you if you don't show up. Not so much if that happens in the military. Excuse me. So it's a different experience, just the transition itself out of that military environment into this more civilian environment, much less student life. In the military, the motto is adapt and overcome. And that's important. It'd be nice if we could all ascribe to that motto. I can't say that I do all the time. I'd like to. But in the military, even though it's regimented and you're expecting things to turn out a particular way, if it doesn't, do you just fold your hands or throw them on your hip and say, well, I can't go any further until so-and-so gets here with that ammunition? No, you adapt and you overcome. So imagine when you're moving into the student life and you come on the first week or so, you want to use your GI Bill, and we all know how simple that paperwork is. Still by U.S. Postal Service. And you have a question. And you go to the first person you see at the Welcome Center, and they look up and they say, go to building E, which is in that direction, or maybe that one, and room 104, and you'll find the person you need. And so they began to wander around and follow all these magnificent signs that we have. You are here, and building E's over here, but that's only if you're looking in that direction. 15 minutes later, you find building E, you go to room 104, and it's locked with a little sign, the little clock that says we'll return, and it says 8, but it doesn't say AM or PM, right? So you go back, find your way. They're not there. Who else can help me? Well, maybe it's financial services. You go to financial services right around the corner, and they say, it's not us. You got to go to see the veteran representative. It's confusing. And it flies in the face of being used to this kind of disciplined, organized way of getting information. And when I go there, I've managed my expectations. It's exactly what I expect. But that doesn't often happen when we're on campus or in the workplace, out in civilian life, because we are much more relaxed. We're all sitting here today. We've got our water and our coffee. We've got wonderful snacks and goodies. The room is situated so that we can relax. The temperature is great. We're not having a snap to. We get to be in relaxed clothes, comfortable shoes. It's a different environment. So that transition from military life into student life can often be complicated because you're talking about two different systems. So transitioning into the college may result in the veteran feeling overwhelmed or frustrated, disoriented. It can be isolating. Many veterans, when they talk about the experience of coming on campus, are very aware that there's a lot more of them than there are of me. I don't see as many other veterans, or I can't readily recognize them because they're not in military uniform. Or I may not be familiar with who's in there. So they often feel a little isolated and distant because they've had a set of experiences that's unlike the civilian population. They may be questioning their identity. I worked with a gentleman a couple of years ago who was a veteran from the Gulf Wars. He was returning to school. He'd been laid off as part of the Great Recession. He was returning to school, and then he'd cancel. And he'd plan on it, get the paperwork, and then he'd not go. Sometimes he would go for the first class, and then he would just not go back. And bless his heart, he was losing a lot of money, a lot of benefits by not continuing. So his wife said, "You need to go see somebody because you have a problem." Don't you love it how our spouses are so clear with us? You have a problem? So he came in and we started talking about what was keeping him from going back. And the reality came down to, his insight was, he was going back to school because it was available, because it sounded like it was something he could do, but it really wasn't something he wanted to do. And when he started to talk about himself in his military role, and then we looked at the course that he had registered for, it didn't fit. And he was saying, "Well, maybe I'm not college material." I said, "Well, maybe you're just not," in his case, an electrician. Maybe we need to look at some other programs, and I can get you hooked up to somebody that can help you and test you. But it's not maybe about your identity going from the military into civilian, although that's often a case for them as well. A lot of folks are military folks. They're comfortable with the military. They like it. Maybe they want to go back. So questioning identity when it feels uncomfortable is not unusual. The paperwork, crazy paperwork. Hopefully, each year I hope that it's going to be streamlined. And I love the fact that on the technical colleges I'm aware of, more and more the resources are being oriented toward helping them, providing them with somebody, usually somebody, who will be their contact person to sit down and help them get through that ridiculous amount of paperwork and get it completed so that they can access their benefits. Many are grieving multiple losses. They may look just fine on the outside. We were talking about that in the last hour. They may look just fine on the outside, but on the inside, they may be having all kinds of feelings that are going on that they're masking. They may be dealing with physical, emotional, or cognitive or thought changes to their thinking. We know that there is an awful lot of traumatic brain injury that goes undiagnosed because it's on the cusp of being really creating problems in their day-to-day life. And oftentimes they are supporting a spouse, family of origin, with full-time work. So that transition and that add-on of going back to school, going into college, transitioning into the civilian world is often a difficult process. So there's a lot of stuff going on in their heads. So if we use that veteran, student veteran is a template for creating an environment, whether it's the campus, the classroom, or the workspace, that's inviting, accommodating, and appropriate. There are about 10 things we need to keep in mind. And the first one is, no surprise here, veterans are unique as individuals, right? Most of you in here would be insulted if I was to bring somebody to the door and say, you don't need to get to know any of these people as individuals because they're just all technical college folk. That'd be insulting, wouldn't it? Because you've each got wonderful attributes and characteristics and wonderful knowledge that is individual to each one of you. And you're all chatty. I've had a chance to experience a lot of that today. And that's great. You've enriched my morning just by allowing me to sit and chat with you a little bit. As a matter of fact, one time early on, I said, hey, there's a group talking. Let me go listen to what they got to say. And it was great. So each of the veterans is unique and individual, just like each of you is unique and individual. And that means we need to get to know them. But oftentimes when we see the military, right, and if they're all wearing a little bit of camouflage or they're wearing their vests or their hats, we tend to say, well, that's veterans. I'll let them have their get-together over here or their social function, and I'll hang out over here, or I don't want to intrude. We somehow get it in our head they're somehow so significantly different from us that we don't want to go there. Not that they're bad, but different. We want to give them their space. Well, get to know them. You might be surprised what you learn. They are warriors, not victims. I had an opportunity when I was working at the National Center for PTSD. I had a chance to just get in a conversation, free-flow conversation one day over on the hospital side with an individual who was waiting on a ride. And he just started spontaneously talking, and oh, we're so glad the Center for PTSD is here, and I'm benefiting, and I feel better, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh, that's great, that's wonderful. I forgot what I was waiting for, but we were just two people in the same space at the same time. He said, but you know, I almost didn't come back after that first time, which had been several years in the past. And I said, why is that? He said, well, when I came in and did the initial paperwork, one of the questions was, what events have you been a victim of? And he said, I believe I tore that paper up, and I'm pretty sure I said some words I shouldn't say. He said, but they don't ask that anymore. They ask, what happened? Which is a whole lot easier. Most of us don't like to be labeled as victims. But certainly in the warrior status, we want to respect, no matter what's happened. They're not victims. Vets are not victims. They are warriors. They may feel alone or isolated, especially on a campus. They may be unaware of those mild traumatic brain injuries or cognitive challenges. Sometimes those are a little bit slower processing of information. Imagine, too, if they've been in the presence of artillery, they may have some hearing loss. So there may be, and they may not be quite aware of it. So they may hear something that's a little bit off or not hear it well. Certainly you want to avoid these three phrases. Believe it or not, there's been research done to determine, it's kind of like in grief, and when people are coming up to you during your grief and they say silly things. Same thing here. People get ridiculously curious, meaning it well, and say, so, did you kill anybody? Or if they hear the veteran espousing some opinion about politics or something in particular about what happened over there, there might be a rather terse statement. Well, you knew what you were signing up for, didn't you? Gets back to that blame the victim. And certainly in some settings on college campuses as well as in the real world, right, there may be differences of opinions or differences in views about war or the military or the government or the president or whatever it might be. But one of the things that has been stated that is found offensive among so many of the military veterans is when individuals begin to say in front of them, wars are atrocities and a waste of human life. Again, it feels a bit like blaming the victim, and sometimes it just feels like an out-and-out slam on their service. So these are the kinds of things that might be okay in an orchestrated environment where the individuals have talked about getting set to debate something, but unfortunately they occur all too often in the context of our classroom, and sometimes between the teacher and the student when the teacher is trying to generate some conversation. Might not be the best choice. Female veterans suffer differently. To date, we continue to have the majority of our veterans are male. And so we have a distinctly male environment in which many females choose to go into. And it's tough. It is tough. They are faced with adapting to a predominantly male warrior environment, physically, socially, emotionally, spiritually, vocationally, and intellectually. 17%, I believe, of the enlisted women in the military today experience PTSD. And of those who are experiencing PTSD, over a third of those is due to sexual trauma experienced in the course of their job as military. Student veterans may want to return to the war, even if it's not possible. That may be what they want to do. And so you may hear that expressed in projects or papers or in discussions. Remember that PTSD is an injury. It's got an external cause. It's not a mental illness. They have certainly earned our respect and our compassion and our understanding, not just for their service, but because they're people. And they are an untapped resource for the future and for the leadership of our country. Any comments on these 10 kind of overarching ideas? Okay. So what are some of the things that we can do to make that on-campus experience more positive, more affirming? Well, first of all, get to know your veterans. If you're the person that's working with them from an administrative perspective, if you're working with them in the classroom, if you're working with them to help get them connected to resources on campus, get to know them. What's your name? Thanks for your service. Where were you? What did you do? How you doing? What are some of the questions that you haven't gotten answered since trying to do this? What are you interested in doing? What are some of the things you're afraid to ask? You can ask me. I'm the person that gets those, and I'll help you get the answers, right? and get to know them. If you are in the classroom, instructors, faculty, some of the richest experiences that you can have in your classroom is the result of getting to know your student veteran. So get to know them. If they need an accommodation due to some kind of physical, emotional, or a psychological wound, again, this is an injury, not an illness, then talk to them about those accommodations as an adaptation. Remember the motto of adapt and overcome. So we don't say things like, oh, okay, so you've got some hearing loss and it's going to take you a little longer to get through your test. Well, let's see how we can work on that and fix it. We haven't had that before. I don't know what I can do to help you out on that. And please don't follow that with, son, even if you're older. Call them by name, right? But they're adaptations, because that's what they're doing. They're adapting to their life today. This is not a fix. It's not something that you're doing to help them out. You are helping to adapt and get them connected to services. Provide places and events where student veterans can connect with one another. There was a study done up in Michigan, and all they did was take a 6-foot plain old plastic fold-out table and put it out in the middle of the little gathering common area, and somebody put a piece of cardboard that said veterans and taped it to the front and left it there. And within just a day, one veteran kind of started hanging out and sitting on the table. And within a week, another guy came up and they got to know one another. And this became sort of a gathering place that eventually actually moved inside. Remember the weather there, right? And moved inside and became a room. Now, you're not required to be a veteran to go into that room, but it is designated as the veterans gathering spot. So when they go in, they talk about that experience. If they're new to campus and somebody tells them about it, they talk about the experience of seeking that room out with excitement, even if it's empty, because you know other people like me occupy that space. It's the power of the environment. In the classroom, here are a few things you can do, in particular in the classroom. You can make and share recordings of the classroom lectures and the discussions. You can also wear a microphone to enhance your auditory clarity. Caption your class videos. Use text that can be obtained electronically and read aloud through an app. I love iPhones today. Wasn't that long ago that they couldn't read to you and they couldn't read your stuff back to somebody else. Post your notes ahead of time if that's possible. Again, accommodate test taking. Maintain your office hours. I know everybody smiles on that one. Okay. Don't surprise the student veteran or put them on the spot by asking inappropriate questions like, what do you think about the president's decision to draw down the troops and blah, 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 in the front of the class? You want to have a private conversation? Ask them if it's okay for you to ask some questions. Don't just assume. Be the role model for compassionate and accepting behaviors. Make your moms proud, right? Do the right thing socially. All right. Know your school's guidelines for addressing disruptive or inappropriate classroom behaviors. It's not unusual in the veteran student group. You may find when they go into the classroom that they choose the seat that's closest to an exit. Or they may move the seat out of your nice and tidy row up against a wall or into a corner. They may sit with their arms crossed or sitting on the desk in front of them and darker shades on. or a hat pulled down low, and it looks like they may be staring out. Those are not necessarily aggressive moods. They are attempting to manage their anxiety, and if they have PTSD, they may be managing some of their symptoms in the presence of an unfamiliar place that they may not feel safe in, and they may not be familiar with the other people. If it's uncomfortable for you, indiscriminately and discreetly after the class, ask them if you can just chat with them for a minute. And if they'll hang around for a second, say, look, I couldn't help but notice you rearranged. Is there anything I can do to help you feel comfortable in this classroom? Let me work with you. Now, they may go into a conversation. They may say, no, I'm good, and they may not say a word and just walk out the door. That's okay. You've extended the offer. If there's a need, odds are they will come back and interact with you. So fidgeting, lateness. I worked alongside a colleague many years ago who liked to lock his classroom door. I get it. I'm just asking that you think about it before you do it. The ability to control the environment in which training is taking place is really important to the overall learning experience for everybody in the classroom. But sometimes it could be that it's a strategy for a person who is uncomfortable and wants to wait to see the landscape before they enter. So again, best way to find that out, get to know the person. And don't always assume that whatever they're doing is a sign of disrespect. Expect the student veteran to be bored. And maybe not just the student veteran. Okay? It happens, right? Expect the student veteran to share experiences that are vivid or raw in papers and projects or reports. That is not necessarily a sign that they need some kind of counseling help. It may just simply be, this is my experience. This is my life. I'm sharing it with you. Model an expectation of adaptation, success, recovery, and hope. And again, compassion is the key. So now my question to you, we've gone through a lot of lists here. There's a lot of information. How is the veteran-friendly campus different from just a plain old person-friendly campus? It should not be, should it? So let's go back a minute. Excuse me. There we go. All right. So let's take out the term military life and just put in there, oh, plain old life. Folks coming to see me on campus. They may or may not be disciplined or regimented, but hey, they made application and got accepted into your school. That speaks for them. And they got there, they found it, they Googled it, they listened to whatever it is that directs them through their phone or car, and they got on campus. Odds are they came from somewhere where they got friends and buddies. They got a social and a family support network. And it takes a lot of action to get there. That's just plain old regular people. They may not have an established motto of adapt and overcome, but I don't know about you and your life story, but I had to adapt and overcome stuff to get to school and to go back to school and to keep going to school and then to go to school a little bit more. So when you're talking about just plain old regular persons out there, whether they're coming in as a student, Maybe they've applied to a position that you have at the school. Maybe this is going to be your colleague or someone who works in IT or in support staff. Same thing. In order to get there, they've had to have a little bit of discipline to go through that application process, to get the interview, to make it through the interview, to get into the hiring process, and to get in there for their orientation. So even though the experiences are a little bit different, you're still looking at many shared characteristics that bring them onto that campus and into your presence. So, whereas the veteran may be experiencing all of these things, the sensory issues, being overwhelmed, disoriented, isolated, feeling isolated, questioning whether or not this is the life for me, did I make the right decision, being frustrated with paperwork. I don't know about you, but when I've been hired into a position before, I've felt all these things. And I haven't served in the military. So it's not unusual for everybody to experience some similar things, just a different context. If we look at the 10 things that create a friendly campus for all people, every person is unique. I like to think we're all warriors. If you're going to college, by golly, you are a warrior. If you are working in a college environment, you have to be a warrior, don't you? That's exactly right. We're not victims. We are here because we want to be and we want to make a difference. That's what a warrior is. Occasionally, you may feel alone or isolated, especially in those early days. If you're watching this as an orientation video, you may be thinking, oh yeah, I'm not even sure if I parked in the right place. I'm not sure where I'm supposed to put my purse. Do I carry it with me when I go to the restroom? I don't know the chain of command. So it's not unusual for all of us to feel alone or isolated. We may all be aware of cognitive changes and traumatic brain injuries in our own lives. I had a traumatic brain injury about 4 years ago. Most days I'm pretty good. Today's a good day for a Friday. I got worried after we set it up for a Friday because a lot of Fridays I don't schedule people that day because I may or may not be able to hang in there and make sense. So that's the day I work with insurance companies. I get a lot more out of them. They're much more sympathetic when I don't make sense. Instead of avoiding phrases like, have you ever killed anybody, which some people may say to just anybody walking up on campus, you know, there are all kinds of social etiquettes. Where are you from? Oh, I'm from XYZ. Oh, nothing good ever comes out of XYZ. Ha, ha, ha. You know, there's a social grace about issuing an invitation and a welcome to anybody, a peer, a colleague, a new student, somebody you haven't met before. So choose words carefully. Recognize that females will experience the work life, the campus life, life in general, differently. We may want to return to war ourselves, and our war may be the place we came from. It may be that we're balancing family, school, a second job, a third job, caregiving, whatever it might be. And it may be that we've got our own war going on in our life. Yes?
There can be a lot of correlation between our students who are leaving high school and coming to college, especially for females who are used to their social set in high school, and now they might be isolated at the college environment because their peers are either not going to college or a different college.
Yes.
So a lot of this returning to the war, returning to the high school setting, having their own unique challenges and possibilities as they move on to this new zone for them as well.
Absolutely. I think that's especially true in our technical colleges, and especially true today in light of the Great Recession, because people do not just automatically all leave from that high school environment and experience and go straight into the school of their choice. And so, yeah, you're looking at folks who are experiencing a lot of loss. You know, we talk about the multiple losses and grievings. They're experiencing those multiple losses. They've left what was familiar and predictable, even if they said they hated it every day. It was familiar and predictable. And so they get out and they do feel isolated and maybe a little uncomfortable about even asking, because they're moving into that adulthood section of their life, that age and stage, and they may not feel comfortable reaching out to others. So that's an important point. Thanks for bringing that up. It's a great correlation. PTSD for anybody, civilian, combat vet, whoever, PTSD is PTSD. The details may be different. The story may be different. But the experience is very similar. But again, it's an injury and not a mental illness. Everybody has earned our compassion, our respect, our understanding. No matter what our life story is or what brings us into that particular environment, everybody deserves that, right? And everybody is an untapped resource, whether it's for our future leaders, connecting with others, finding out what their capacity and ability and their strengths are. But everybody has that potential. So again, we can listen closely to each of the folks that we come in contact with and affirm the richness of their stories. And even reflect on how it adds and enriches your story. If they need an accommodation for some reason, physical, emotional, social, psychological, think about it and refer to it as an adaptation. Accommodation makes it sound like I'm doing something for you because you're less than. So we want to talk about it in terms of adaptations. We want to provide places and events where everybody can go. If you brought in a new colleague and you guys are having, Pizza Friday, let them know before Friday shows up in case they're bringing their lunch. Hey, we're having pizza on Friday. If you want to throw in $5, we can get the cinnamon sticks. Instead of having them walk into the break room with their sack lunch and thinking, oh, that makes me different. I wasn't invited, right? So we're anticipating and being intentional and mindful about creating places and events for everybody where they can connect with one another. In the classroom, when we've got just plain old folk, right? You're going to, again, these are all great. You don't know who's sitting out there who might have some need. 22 years at the airlines, earplugs were not fashionable, and I'm paying for it today. I don't hear very well. There's certain ranges that are gone, but I looked cute. But this idea of captioning things, of being able to put it somewhere where maybe I can get headphones on later on and turn up the volume even more, or make other accommodations for me, that's great. But I can guarantee you if I went onto a campus, I wouldn't ask somebody to do that for me. I would just try to read lips or sit up close or, catch other stuff or share notes with somebody. I'd do everything but, because I would think it's not that big a deal. So it doesn't have to be something that's obvious. So any of these ideas, posting notes ahead of time, accommodating test taking, maintaining your office hours, once again, not surprising them by putting them on the spot. How many times, I know this happens in K through 12, but when it happened in college, I could throw out a question as I've done here today, and you always know who doesn't want to answer, because what do? We can same thing in the classroom as well as at work. You know, anybody know the deadline on section C of that report? And everybody ducks like that. You know, instead of asking those kinds of questions or putting people on the spot, do it privately, or at least give some grace when you're asking for it. And again, you want to make sure that we are being the role model for compassion and accepting behaviors when we're interacting with others. Again, moving through the last few, know the school's guidelines for addressing the disruptive or inappropriate behaviors, whether that's in the work environment or the classroom or campus environment. Even in the general population, lateness, fidgeting, etc., that may not be a sign of disrespect. It may in fact be a different sign of discomfort. They may be uncomfortable or unsure. Expect people to be bored. No matter what. Boredom is not just for the student veteran, it is for all of us. Expect them to share experiences that may not be what you expected, but it may be their life. And again, model an expectation of adaptation, success, recovery, and hope. Compassion is the key to interacting with everyone and celebrate their presence in the class. Now, we've covered a lot of material today. I'm going to hang around for a few minutes after the training, but I want to thank all of you for being here today. I want to thank Brent Keeney from Cameron & Associates for his support in making this happen. I certainly want to thank David and Jim for their assistance today, and Arbor Productions, a fabulous service. Thank you to the church for allowing us this space, and thank you for you and all that you've brought to it today. Thank you again. Thank you.